Hello, bonjour. I'm Andrew Mosker, President and CEO of National Music Centre, and this is the NMC Amplifier podcast. This week's episode is another first for the NMC Amplifier podcast, and it was such a remarkable and thought-provoking conversation that we felt we just had to share it. I was recently asked to moderate a panel discussion about the future of music for the Canadian Country Music Association seminar series during this year's Country Music Week in Calgary. I want to give a huge thank you and shout out to the CCMAs for inviting me, allowing me the privilege of participating as moderator, and a very special thank you to the panelists for sharing their incredible insights and perspectives on such a complex topic. It was truly an honor, so please stay tuned to hear more. Let's take a quick break to thank West Anthem for co-presenting this conversation with the National Music Centre. West Anthem was established to help stimulate growth and sustainability of Alberta's music industry and is committed to the development of music cities in our province. To learn more about West Anthem, go to westanthem.com. National Music Centre is a registered charity with a mission to amplify love, sharing, and understanding of music. Find out about all the great things NMC does to support music in Canada by heading to studiobell.ca. If you'd like to hear more podcasts and interviews, watch live concerts, artist videos, or read about stories about music in Canada, check out amplify.nmc.ca. If you enjoy this podcast or any other content that NMC creates, please take a minute to like, subscribe, or leave a comment, or share this show with your friends. NMC relies on donor support to carry out our mission. Please consider leaving a donation by following the link in the description. So first, a little bit of housekeeping before we get into it. I want to give a little backstory on the National Music Centre's relationship with the Canadian Country Music Association and why I was asked to moderate the upcoming discussion. As the physical home of the Canadian Country Music Hall of Fame, National Music Centre has worked very closely over many, many years with the Canadian Country Music Association through a range of activities here at the National Music Centre. And that history goes back prior to the National Music Centre. In fact, it goes back to as far as 2009. And that relationship with the Canadian Country Music Association was one of the first true national partnerships that we cemented, one of the first true national collections of Canadian country music and music memorabilia that we ever acquired as an organization. So our relationship with the CCMAs was really, in a lot of ways, the first attempt at the National Music Centre to become national. And so the relationship goes back many years, and it's a very important one to us. I also wanted to quickly preface the conversation by explaining my intention about how I wanted to approach moderating such a complex topic. I mean, think about it. How would you respond to the question, what is the future of music? It's an incredibly broad question, and it can be approached from so many different perspectives. My attempt with this invitation from the CCMAs was to try to put a lens on it that brought some modern themes together, but at the same time trying to shine a specific light on Calgary. As the Canadian Country Music Association is a national organization, and they visit a different city every year, coming to Calgary with their national program served as a perfect opportunity to shine a light on Calgary. So this is how I sort of narrowed it down. It came down to this. How do we bring the intersectionality of music, modern technology, community development, and placemaking together? For example, things like tech innovations like artificial intelligence, resiliency of artists and communities and musical infrastructure, adapting to these changes, diversity, inclusion, equity, and what role does wellness and mental health play in music? And then sort of the subtext of that was, if you work in this ecosystem, this music ecosystem, how are you adapting to still reaching fans? How are organizations adapting to reaching fans? What roles can communities play in becoming more diverse and inclusive? And what do some of those opportunities look like over the next 5 to 10 years? So still a broad topic, but much more narrower than just throwing out the question, what is the future of music? And I want to say this, I'm not sure we put enough emphasis on the depth of this topic, but I think all of us, everyone involved in shaping the future of music, needs to really consider all the different perspectives out there when thinking about things like modern technology, broadband internet, community development, and so on. My guests will shed some light on these different points, as you will hear in this podcast, because they all come from very different backgrounds. And they are all influential in their own way in our music community here in Calgary. It was enlightening for me at times to hear how each of them interpreted this topic and how they each responded to different parts of the conversation. And I'm really grateful to all of them for sharing their own personal stories. I learned a lot from the discussion. It opened my eyes to a lot of things. And I think our listeners will learn lots too. On that note, let's dive into the future of music.
When you say black music, I think automatically, just to generalize, some people would just go to hip hop. It's hip hop, that's rap. But black music is rock and roll, it's country, it is jazz, of course it's hip hop, it's all of things. And the fact that we have to have these categories called urban music or contemporary R&B and traditional R&B, you're talking about limiting people's creation and an audience to these categories that don't match expression.
The outreach is always going to be the issue for a lot of Indigenous music work, I guess you could say, or working with Indigenous artists and in Indigenous communities. They can't afford Spotify, but then they also might not have access to it because they don't have a cell phone, they don't have the internet, they don't have ways of actually communicating to have that.
So without further ado, here's our wonderful panel. To my right here, Curtis Running Rabbit-Lefthand, amazing individual who founded IREM, Indigenous Resilience in Music, to help elevate the voices of Indigenous artists in the music industry and give them tools to pursue careers in music. Amazing story, started in 2015, has moved on to work full-time in music for a number of different organizations, including his own called AM Entertainment, as well as an organization that works closely with APTN. So it's great to have you here, Curtis. Really great to have you here. And also next to Curtis is Beni Johnson. I first met Beni Johnson really just through reading about him as a Top 40 Under 40 recipient, and the work that he's done in the hip-hop community and also to advance black music in this community. And he also a hip-hop artist and an MC himself and a great organizer of music. So welcome, Beni. Curtis, by the way, I forgot to say, today is Curtis's birthday. So happy birthday, Curtis. Happy birthday, Curtis.
And I'm also a Top 40 recipient.
And you're also a Top 40 recipient, 2019, that's right. And I failed to mention that Curtis is working now with Red Music Rising, which is part of APTN. Just to the right of Beni is Mariya Stokes. So Mariya Stokes is a full-time musician, songwriter, and artist here working in the Calgary area. And I've known Mariya for many years and is someone who has worked very closely in the country music community, was a runner-up for Project Wild, has won quite a few Alberta Music Country Awards, and I'm very honored to be on the Calgary Host Committee for the CCMAs this year, and she's the co-chair of the Legacy Committee and has done some great work in building that community. And Evan Hugh, who I just met backstage for the first time. Evan is a serial entrepreneur and executive coach and a founder of several startups, tech startups, including OmniLogic. But he's on this panel because he was one of the founders of Maple Music way, way, way back in about 2002, 2003, which is now called Cadence Music. So Evan is a Rainforest Fellow and been involved in really coaching startups and also as an investor and creator of tech startups. So I think we've got a really great set of perspectives here that we're going to share. And this is the most amount of talking that I'm going to do on this panel. And I'm going to just really turn it over and direct some questions to our panelists. And I'm going to start first with Evan. And in terms of technology, because the premise of this panel and this keynote was really to kick it off with where does technology impact the future of music in the next 10 to 15 years? So we'll start off with Evan with some general comments, and then the rest of the panelists will jump in, and then we'll direct to some other specific questions for the rest of the panelists. So over to you, Evan. You've started off getting involved in music way long time ago in the Napster days of late 1999, and then we're one of the founders of Maple Music. So what can you tell us about where technology is influencing the future of music in the next 10 to 15 years? Let's give it up for Evan Hugh.
Sure. I mean, I have a long, winding story with music, and I've pivoted out the last few years. I've been busy in the community and in the tech community. And I got involved with music because, like a lot of us, I love music. I came from a house full of music, immigrant family. But I made that fateful decision that I had to make a living, and music was hard. So I didn't. But I found my way back in. In the late 90s, a bunch of us were software developers, and I was on top of technology. And the one thing I already learned by then, that the only constant in tech was constant change. It was always changing. There was always stuff going on. So a lot of you probably in this room weren't around in those 1990s, but CDs were the medium, and we had vinyl and then cassettes and then CDs, and digitization was just starting to be something big. And then there's all these disruptive technologies, and if you look under the hood under Napster, it's incredibly crude, but it basically upended the entire industry. No one knew what to do. And it was 1999 when Napster was founded, and I tripped over it. I went, what the heck is this thing, right? And I realized what this guy Fanning and those guys had was a distribution mechanism that was going to go around everything. If you go back then, the labels and the distributors and that whole supply chain was completely locked down and controlled. And musicians, and many of my friends who were musicians, had no idea what they were getting themselves into on the business side. And the internet wasn't full of useful information at the time. Like today, the big change that I see is that, especially young people, and I have young sons who they have day jobs, but they're composers. They're actually video game developers, and they've published and they write their own music and do all this crazy polymathic kind of stuff, which I'm extremely jealous of. But where it's going is going to bigger and greater things, I think. So I'm the classic optimist. I mean, I know the world has a lot of shitty stuff going on right now, but music's one of those bright spots in my mind. And what I can say is that there's a convergence of some really interesting things going on. So I'll get you guys to think about something. I love asking this question, but can anyone throw out, when do you think the first iPhone was announced by Steve Jobs? iPhone 1. Do you guys remember what year that was? Any idea? Anyone?
Curtis, Beni, Mariya, do you know when that was? I don't know. Anybody in the audience know when that was?
Yeah. He said 1995.
No, iPhone 1, 2007. Okay.
Oh, not that long ago.
Not that long ago, okay? And think about how this stupid device runs our lives. Everyone, I can't imagine there's anyone in this room that does not have a smartphone. And is probably feeling that they should reach for it right now, okay? And for music, I'm sure we all have music access, whether you've loaded up songs or you're using a streaming service, but it's become part of our lives, right? And that constant change is going to keep increasing, right? I had some interesting stats. I was actually breaking bread with a bunch of friends that were in the music industry who were bemoaning the collapse of NFTs and the crypto world, which I did warn them. I'm a little grumpy about stuff like that myself because I think there's a lot of basically BS, right? But as in all new things, there's a whole wave of grifters and bullshit artists that come with the territory, and then things level themselves out, and then you find the real value. Anyways, we're talking about Spotify and streaming services that are moaning about how little revenue there actually is for the artist. And if you break it down, it's tiny, right? Okay. But it opens up things. And the one thing we looked up was a statistic on Spotify, for example. On a monthly engagement standpoint, 80% of the artists on Spotify have less than 50 engagements a month. So there's a concept called the long tail. I don't know if you get a chance to look it up, but the industry has always been a long tail where the vast majority of economic activity making money is on a tiny percentage, and then the rest of us trail out, I was like many of you, well, I don't know, some of you guys are actually probably at the other end, but I was, as a young man, garage band, cover band type person making peanuts, right? And it still is that way, even with digital distribution. So I can go on. I could probably let the other panelists talk, but
Thanks,
the
Evan.
constant is constant change. And there's lots of opportunity.
Curtis, with your work with it, with IREM and equipping Indigenous artists with new tools and with workshops, trying to bridge the gap in Calgary music festivals, which was part of the early work of IREM. I know IREM has moved on. You've moved on to other things beyond IREM. Was technology ever part of the discussion in helping Indigenous artists be better equipped to break into the music industry?
For IREM, actually, before I start, I just want to introduce myself. Okay, kasi simaksamok po nasduan nakat sa stomach ka nanamok to siksika tapi sinasiksikaw na ikimana ikinakukit sitopi ikinaono kuama. Yeah, that's just a quick introduction.
Thank you for doing that.
But yeah, so like he said, my name is Curtis, Running Rabbit-Lefthand. I worked for Indigenous Resilience in Music. I did a lot of work. I've been in the music industry outside of IREM for about 10 plus years, almost on 12 years now, just promoting shows and stuff like that. But when I got into working specifically with Indigenous artists and creating platforms for Indigenous musicians and Indigenous youth, technology wasn't really like a talked about thing, because I think a lot of times that you like when you think about it, our biggest issue as an organization was our outreach, is how far we can reach out to the community, because a lot of times we noticed we were becoming a very urbanized organization, and we noticed that there was a lot of voices on different reservations throughout Treaty 7 that we wanted to give a platform to. So when we got, for the organization itself, when we got into working with the community, and even working in an urban setting in Calgary, we never really thought about like technology and how that affects Indigenous musicians and how it can boost their plays, their streaming platforms, how we can boost that, how the marketing can look different for them. And one is identifying as an Indigenous musician or musician in Indigenous musician in music, and how to just strategize around that. That was something that we never really dove into, because our biggest issue, and it's a lot, and you kind of think about it a lot of the times for Indigenous people and Indigenous organizations, is the issue you usually comes down to is, before talking about technology, before talking about marketing, before talking about all these things, is the outreach. Because the communities are so, they're so vast, they're so far away, there's thousands of kids on these different reservations that you're working with, that a lot of the times like that takes the back burner. But then even in that too, is that moving from IREM to Red Music Rising, are like, again, we're a sister arm's length company, and owned by APTN and a bunch of other head companies that create the organization itself. But one of the things that now, because we work in artist management and in as a record label, we're diving more into that right now, and that experience of how to understand technology as it grows, how to understand streaming platforms as they grow, statistically how it fits for an Indigenous musicians on those platforms, whether it be YouTube, Spotify, all these different platforms that are being introduced, like Tidal. That's becoming more real. But then even for that organization, like, again, the outreach is always going to be the issue for a lot of Indigenous music work, I guess you could say, or working with Indigenous artists and in Indigenous communities, because technology is always just in the back burner. Like, you have to think about like getting broadband out there. Like, kids don't have access to, they can't afford Spotify, but then they also might not have access to it because they don't have a cell phone, they don't have the internet, they don't have ways of actually communicating to have that. And so, for the music industry as a whole, like, I think obviously like technology is growing and the music industry is growing with it. And there's creating new strategies of navigating these new platforms that exist, again, to boost those those streaming statistics that you want to see increased, and to see your music also increase with what traffic is coming through, and how you're being viewed, and how many views you get, how many listens you get, all of that stuff. But when it comes to working with Indigenous people and Indigenous musicians, there's a lot of other reoccurring and constantly occurring social paradigms and structures that keep us one step behind in a lot of ways, which is not our fault though. So that if we're thinking about that, like we can open up a whole can of worms on why it's not our fault, and how we can like move forward and talk about all of that stuff. But there's still when we talk about technology, like I can hear this stuff and I know, like I understand what you're talking about because of the artists I work with. But then when it comes to working with Indigenous youth, some Indigenous musicians that are, could be in Iqaluit, they could be somewhere else where they also don't have access to that. I know there's musicians that are becoming they're becoming big artists, but they remain on the reservation too, and they don't want to leave, and then they sometimes don't have access to a lot of what we have in the urban setting. And again, it is a one step behind. So it's an issue to think about and talk about, but it's also something that is also not our fault. Why we're in that situation. And so, it's definitely hard to navigate and to discuss a lot of times.
Understand. So thank you for that perspective. And also for the greeting. I'm really grateful for the greeting. And before we move on, I know Rob did the land acknowledgement. And one thing I just wanted to add to my notes, just to echo some comments from Curtis, was what personal learnings have I've gone through as someone that lives and works here in Mohkinstsis, beyond just doing a land acknowledgement. And I didn't include this in my comments, but after hearing Curtis talk, I wanted to just take a quick step back. I live and work in this neighborhood, and I've learned quite a bit from elders who come to National Music Center, Leonard Bastien and Elvin Weaselchild in particular. And this place has been, for those of you that don't live in Calgary or here in Mohkinstsis, has been a place where people have been gathering for thousands of years, really, in this very neighborhood. And music has been a big part of that gathering. And I didn't know that until I really started to learn and take an effort and a step into learning more about it. And I think Curtis's comments just about access, whether it's broadband or some other technological thing, is an important learning, I think, for all of us to understand. So I really appreciate you bringing that up. And I think this tradition of gathering on these lands, which has been happening for thousands of years, and where music has been part of that celebration, which is what I've learned from the elders I've worked with, is what we're doing here, right today, and also as the broader story of Canadian Country Music Week being here in Calgary. So I just wanted to share that, just take a step back from my opening comments. Curtis touched on another question, and we're going to kind of jump around on this panel about community building. And IREM and the work that Curtis has done is really, really inspirational, and it's foundational work to create tools and give tools and skills to Indigenous artists. And he touched on some of the challenges that Indigenous artists simply don't have, and that they're gradually overcoming. So I just wanted to applaud you again for that work, and that work continues. Beni Johnson has done similar work, particularly in the hip-hop community and the black music community. Beni, so why don't we talk a little bit about the work that you've done with 10 to 10, and what was some of the impetus behind it, just as the way Curtis laid it out so beautifully.
Yeah, I think I can actually leverage a little bit of the technology talk as well. I'm from a small town, northern Alberta. I'm from Fort McMurray. So I'm an immigrant who came here from Ghana, and we came during the 80s boom of oil. And, being a young kid up there, naturally you get attracted to things like music, breakdancing, so on, etc. And being up there, technology was massive because I was able to download Acid Pro and start recording my own music and burning it onto a CD. And it was the first time I was even ever done in that city. And all of a sudden you start growing in your craft. And at the time there was a group that was pretty popular in Canada called Swollen Members. And they were kind of on Much Music all the time and stuff. And they ended up touring Alberta. And we ended up getting on that tour. And the best thing from that was after we were done that tour, the manager was like, hey, you guys are really good at what you do. You should kind of get to a bigger city. Calgary's got a really decent scene going on. Get down there and see what's happening and start pushing your career. So we're like, oh my God, let's do that. So we moved to Calgary. And naturally, when we got here, it wasn't the big dream that he kind of painted out for us. So now we were artists who were, really hungry to kind of do this thing in a very serious way, but a lot wasn't set up for us to do that. So we kind of looked around and said, hey, what could we look at to create an opportunity where we could actually be seen by other people, be respected, and find some other people doing their craft. I also played basketball and football as a kid, so the biggest thing for me was bringing people together. You played basketball on courts, and you always got better when you played pickup games with other people. So the idea was like, how do you just go ahead and start forming a room or an area or an environment where a lot of people who were like you or interested in what you're in could start vibing together? And where could we have a space that was safe to allow us to kind of be ourselves? I know some people understand that nightclubs, even to this day, I guess, but especially, 10, 15 years ago here, you had to be dressed a certain way to even be allowed to get in. If there was too many of you coming to the door, you weren't allowed in because the clubs were even quoted as too black. So you start entering a space where you can't even enter the club to listen to the music that's actually going on. So for us, we wanted to create a night where you could just be yourself, look how you want to look, but also still create a safe space where artists and music can actually grow. Where you could also be respected, because when you said you're a rapper from Calgary, Alberta, right away, it's easy to have a smirk on your face about it because, it just is what it is. We're known as the country town, cowboy town, and that maybe the perspective of what hip hop doesn't belong to anybody that's from Alberta. So that space was like, how do we create this space that's just the one safe haven, just once a month, so we can actually have that opportunity to find each other. And this is at a time where there was, less technology. So it's MySpace, what was the other one? MP3.com. And you had to search up if an artist was from Calgary, try to find where they were, and then maybe send them an email at their Yahoo address that was already bouncing. So it was a pretty rough time where you couldn't just hop onto a social media platform and find the next artist. So you had to actually congregate into a space together. And at that time as an artist as well, it was very important for you to be good as a live performer, because that's how you got seen, that's how you got to different cities, that's how you allowed an audience to find you. Whereas now, going to the technology talk, you're able to create a song in your bedroom and be seen by anybody across the world. So it's a massive opportunity to create communities internationally now that you didn't have 10, 15 years ago. You really had to find the people next to you. And I think it was very important to create that community, because people like myself were definitely not given the opportunity to do so, whether we weren't allowed into the venues or we weren't given the technology or the tools to be able to kind of advance ourselves. And I think that's all I'll touch on for now.
All right. Thank you for that story. I mean, I think two great community builders here. We're going to come back to that with some more conversation soon. I wanted to move to another artist on the panel, Mariya Stokes. As I mentioned in the introduction, Mariya is a songwriter, a performer, a singer, a community activist, a member of the CCMA host committee this year, and the co-chair of the Legacy Committee. And so, Mariya, what is your journey? How has your journey been as an artist working here in Calgary? And what are some of the different, ways in which you are, furthering the work that you do here in the community as a working artist?
Yeah, thanks for having me, Andrew. I'm originally from a tiny little town about an hour south of Calgary called Stavely, Alberta. And so when I was 18, I was like, I'm going to go to the big city and figure out how to build a career in music. And so coming back to technology, it's interesting because there are some really incredible resources here in Calgary and Alberta for artists to engage in. Alberta Music is one. Canadian Country Music Association is another. Breakout West is another. But when I was a little baby artist, I was really, really nervous and had some pretty heavy imposter syndrome. And so it took me a couple of years to even engage in the community in person. I think it was like probably 3 or 4 years into being a full-time musician that I finally had the guts to show up at these industry events and meet these folks and go to educational seminars like this. And so coming back to technology, social media, and connecting with community that way, and then also being able to find resources online that would help me, educate me a little bit about the music business, or songwriting workshops and things like that. That was really instrumental in my development. And then with that, once I started kind of venturing into the community and meeting other artists, I really found, I found a home in the community and ended up doing a couple projects with the Calgary Drop-In and Rehab Center, and being an artist in residence at the Women's Center. And then I feel like as soon as you start getting involved with community, it continues to grow and grow and grow, and there's just there's always more work to be done. And that's, I think, how I ended up on the host committee. I'm not really sure. Basically, the music industry for me in Calgary has been blindly walking through, the mist, seeing the mist clear once in a while because I've found a community of people who are trying to do the same thing as me, and then getting back into the mist and pretending I know what I'm doing.
Well, you're doing a good job at pretending
Thank
and knowing
you.
what you're doing.
Thank you.
I think you're doing more than a good job, and I think everybody on this panel is always just looking for ways at which that we can improve the ecosystem here.
Absolutely.
And technology is obviously a tool. It's not the answer to all the problems. It's just something that we have to confront. And I think again, coming back to Curtis, I think the original impetus of creating IREM, from how you've described, is to elevate voices and provide, access to Indigenous voices so they can find a way to penetrate the music industry. And so I think, Mariya, your point of sort of being led through the abyss, because it can be pretty foggy at times.
Well, and I would say with that as well, is I've felt like I've walked through the abyss in the mist, and I have white privilege and am a straight passing woman. So for me, the fog was fog, but I'm sure I know it was a lot thinner. So huge thank you to you guys for sharing your stories and continuing to build the community.
Yeah, thanks, Mariya.
Thank you.
You're welcome.
Evan, I just want to go back to you just for a second, and then we'll come back to Curtis and Beni a bit more about community building. In terms of where technology is now, what are some of the trends that you're seeing happening in the coming few years that I think everyone that works in this music ecosystem just needs to be aware of?
Sure, and I like to acknowledge what everyone said here, by the way. Everyone's from somewhere, and most of us are from nowhere. And this industry is pretty brutal for having big egos and a lot of appearances and projecting and basically BS, right? And that's what you discover once you penetrate that veil. You wait a second, they don't know what they're doing either. Nobody in this industry knows what they're doing. I'm just going to say that at every level,
It's
right?
a fact, though. That's a fact.
It's true.
It's so true. Like there's so many fronts, and so. But as a young person, I had no confidence either. I think that's probably a common theme here of every musician I've talked to: fear, uncertainty, doubt, imposter syndrome. Am I good enough? I don't look it. I don't, whatever it is, right? So I think, by the way, before I get into the tech part, role modeling is really important, storytelling. And this kind of stuff is really important I'm big on the youth because I do work in the tech community, and it's a similar theme over there, right? But specifically around what I see is happening in tech in the next 10, 15 years. Obviously, Curtis touched on one really important thing I think is important is universal broadband access, right? And if I was going to, kind of push on music industry leaders, there should be a united front in Canada to have broadband access as a universal human right. Everyone should have access everywhere.
Yeah,
here. So we think about
in every other funding body out there that can do that.
Yeah, well, so because we actually have the technology that any person can express themselves through music anywhere, anytime now, right? A young kid sitting in their bed in a house in the middle of literally nowhere, thousands or hundreds of miles away from the closest point of civilization off a winter highway or something, could actually record, mix, collaborate through the internet with other people around the world, right? And one thing, music universally has been basically a art of influence, right? So, I remember that quote, good artists steal, great artists steal with both hands, right? So, I've watched and listened to music evolve. It's kind of like country music, right? When I was a kid, had a very specific set of social rules of how country music, Nashville kind of recording studio rules, and you had to play a certain way. Otherwise, it wasn't country music, right? And then, I listen to country music today, I went, wait a second, I don't even know if it's country music anymore, right? What is this? And genre rules are breaking down everywhere, and influences are coming from everywhere. Like, who could have imagined that K-pop would be where it is today, right? Like, no one could have predicted that 10 years ago. So the big thing in technology is lack of predictability. So don't get set into this is the way things are, right? One. So as broadband expands and people get on, I think AI is going to be one of these really double-edged swords. So if you're not aware, I would spend a little time trying to understand how the algorithms for all the social media platforms work, because they are disturbing at so many levels, right? And they're not going to be regulated, so it's going to be the Wild West. And the platforms, TikTok, YouTube, Spotify, whatever, they're all out there. They're going to constantly evolve. So you know what? Who would have thought that Facebook is starting to face an existential crisis? That's my opinion. I think Facebook is dying, actually. I'm in that radical camp.
I want to know more about that.
Yeah. Okay, so we could talk more. TikTok is the 800-pound new gorilla.
Yep.
Right? And it's Chinese-owned and, big business as it is geopolitical. This is big business, right? So people as artists can use these platforms, but you got to look over the horizon and see what's going on and things. Imagine, I am always blindsided, by the way, and so are all the experts. Who could have predicted the rise of TikTok? I thought, as usual, every time I think, okay, technology's done. Facebook dominates this, right? Instagram dominates that, blah, blah, blah. TikTok comes out of the blue and blows everyone away. So there'll be another TikTok somewhere. But the economics of producing music, so content creation is as good as it's ever going to get, good as it's ever been, and it's going to keep getting better. So the issue is, I think, for young artists is obviously community building is really important. Education and at broad span, I think artists can, those that want to can create, produce, distribute their music all on their own. It's actually not that difficult, but they have to know how to do it. So I think doing that is probably more important than actually the technology. The technology problems have been mainly solved, right? But it becomes more of a social issue, right? So community building, I think, and awareness of that opportunity is really important. So the AI algorithms is a problem. I think there's going to be a sea change, and I'll hand the mic to other people. I'll just bring up this interesting factoid. So when you look at the most popular downloads, there's an interesting, curious thing, like not downloads, but streaming. So it's not downloading anymore; it's gone to streaming. I show my age because I automatically say download instead of streaming. All the artists, of course, I think Ed Sheeran is right at the top. The Weeknd is right at the top. They're basically people who are, let's say, under 35 that dominate. But the really weird thing you look at is who's making the most money through live music. It's all boomer artists. Rolling Stones, Elton John, Bruce Springsteen, U2, and all that, right? And I'm not sure what I'm going to do with that factoid, but it's an interesting differentiation of, I don't know who said it, but you don't have to be a live act anymore. Back in the day, you had to be a live act. Maybe it was Beni, I think, yeah. And there's a big shift there, too. And this gives a lot of avenues to a lot of different people around the world, right? So maybe I'll leave it at that and let some others jump in.
Well, I think you just identified a really interesting point about the fact that for boomer artists, people are buying tickets and they're going out, and we're not seeing the same levels of compensation online happening. So there's obviously money there, but that's something that historians will debate down the road. Clearly,
it's a sociology problem, because you're absolutely right. I mean, the Gen Zers, I don't see them going to concerts.
Yeah.
Well, there's an economic issue: $500 to $1,000 for a concert ticket.
It's prohibitive for most people, right? So
it's becoming crazy, but because of the whole pandemic, we also experimented with digital streaming. right? So you saw U2 try a bunch of times to do like some live concerts, and it didn't hit the same. But one of the things that blew up on the hip hop side was something called Versus. And it was an Instagram stream where you could be just on your Instagram, and the two producers would link up, and they would go beat for beat, 20 songs each. And at the end of it, you would decide who was the best. But these were the best in the industry. These are all legends, though, too. It wasn't like the newer artists. It was a bunch of the legends, people that you were like, I had no idea, like I produced that, like Brian Michael Cox and stuff like that, right? And you're like, and Teddy Riley, you're like, oh my God, like I didn't know you guys produced these songs. So you had this new appreciation, and it was just these guys sitting in their studios across the world. And it kind of changed as everything opened up. They started doing live shows and stuff again. But that idea of what's it gonna look like in 10 years if you could stay in your own studio production and stream to 2 million people and you get $1 per person, right? So it can become better, but we have to also understand what's happening in the metaverse and what's happening in, with holographic projection and stuff, because a lot of that flat screen watching a performance isn't the same. But now imagine an immersed environment where you're sitting in the audience on your couch.
You triggered me on metaverse because
I know.
I'm not a big fan. I think it's super early days, right? Like it's going to be a decade before that's going to flesh out. But I should have mentioned platforms like Twitch and Discord, right?
Yeah.
And in the music industry, people in general, a lot of them don't pay a lot of attention to video gaming, right? I'm a huge video gaming bithead.
Especially if you have kids. If you have kids, you have to pay attention to it.
And I game, right? So, but music in games is really a critical component of gaming, right? And most people don't realize how important that is to a game and how big the music industry portion of video gaming is. But the platforms that they have for sharing, and there's lessons to be learned there for Twitch broadcasting and Discord groups and whatnot. Some musicians have gone there because, in every bad thing like COVID, some good stuff came out of it, or interesting things have come out. So, yeah.
Speaking on that space, Fortnite did that. They did a live concert in the game with Travis Scott. So now people are playing games or tuning in or joining the game just to watch a concert in a 3D environment.
My kids play Fortnite, and they're 10 and 12, and they said, "Hey, Dad, you ever heard of Coachella?" I'm like, yeah, I've heard of Coachella. Do you know there's a section in Fortnite you can actually go to Coachella.
That's insane.
And like they were telling me about Skins with Rick Astley and all these other songs from my days that you could purchase on Fortnite. Wanted to come back to Curtis and your comments and your perspective around where do you see your community building work continuing into the future, given all the things that we're talking about, and also some of the challenges that you laid out initially in your opening comments?
That's a big question.
Future of music's a huge question. I know.
Yeah. Like for myself, to what you said about and not to knock on what you said, but just the, not knowing where we come from and stuff like that. Like one of the things that popped in my head is like, well, for Indigenous people and specifically for Blackfoot people, like we do know where we come from. We have a long history of our culture and our songs. And when we get into the music industry, for myself, when I got into the music industry, I knew where I was going. I knew what I wanted to attempt to accomplish in the music industry. And all of that circles back to my cultural identity in being Blackfoot. And maybe I can't speak for other cultures, maybe that's just a Blackfoot thing, but that's something for me that I feel is really important to note, because to your question, in 15 years, because of me knowing who I am, me knowing my culture, the language and songs and our rich history that exceeds since time immemorial, this is where we have our ancestors, our people have lived for centuries, for a millennia. So for myself, when I think 15 years, that's something where if I'm in the music industry, cool. If I'm in music, cool. But if I'm not, I'm already like at a point where, you know, I'm already doing what I've wanted to be doing and accomplishing that. And that in 15 years, my only thing that I hope is that after me, if I'm in doing this stuff in 15 years, is that someone else comes after me to take up the reins to do what I'm doing so I can continue on, because that voice and that work ethic in the music industry needs to continue on. So it's hard to answer specifically to technology on that side of things, because like I said, it's more like it gets really difficult to kind of navigate that, because and I did knock on, you know, like Factor. They always get knocked on for a lot of funding things. But, you know, I'm talking about funding bodies that, with what you're talking about broadband, like that outreach, and that can increase in the next 15 years, because these funding bodies have the I know for a fact that they have the opportunities to act on things like that, to engage in those conversations with Indigenous communities, to help, you know, they're like, I can tell you for a fact, out of, when I said thousands of kids on the reservation, there's hundreds of those that have talent that is exceeding all the biggest stars that we know today in music. And they don't have access to the internet. They don't have access to streaming platforms. They don't have access to a lot of that stuff. And the ones who are becoming stars, the Indigenous artists that I do work with, and you know, help on art and artist management, is they understood that, and they had the opportunity for that, but those opportunities don't always come around that they can, you know, get to that point. So in 15 years, I personally would just like to see the outreach expand to where technology, in an ethical way and in an appropriate way, is introduced, where, you know, for Indigenous people, even when we talk about technology, you know, when I talk about my culture and songs and our history as being Nisitapi or Siksagay, being Blackfoot, you know, we have, like, you know, for the first person that, and his name was Nitaka Nine Stuku. His name was Mountain Chief. He was the first person to actually have himself recorded onto vinyl. And a lot of people don't realize that he was the first person to actually be an Indigenous person to sing songs onto a vinyl record that was like introduced into our communities. But our people were so afraid of that act itself, because it was a new form of technology that was essentially taking his voice, which is not okay for us. Because for us, you know, we have, again, I'm not going to share too much, but because of our protocols, that was something that you weren't allowed to do, because it was brand new and we had never seen that, but also it's just so foreign, you know? So also you had to think about those aspects of like how now, like, that's a time where that was introduced and now it's accepted, and now, you know, things have evolved and things have changed, but how to appropriately approach the situation where, if you're introducing technology to a community, and I can tell you for a fact, you're going to have a lot of issues with a lot of Blackfoot people and elders that have, like, you know, they're going to have their qualms with it. How to do it in an ethical way where you get them signing off on it and saying, okay, yes, like, this is something that we can do and we agree with. You know, like, because essentially you also have to look at, again, Indigenous youth that don't have access, and how to give them access in a lot of that, in respect to their talents, in respect to giving them opportunities. But then how that's introduced can be another difficult, like, again, like, for me, it's just more complicated than it is for a lot of the people on this panel, because it comes in with a cultural thing. And then it comes from my own upbringing as well, the struggles I faced and having to go through those struggles and understanding the music industry and navigating that, and then you know, having to see like what, like, you know, I did the garage band thing, like I did that with bands and all of that, and having to understand, but I didn't know what that was. I didn't know what garage band was. I didn't know why things were being put, like, mic'd a certain way and you record stuff. I didn't know how that all worked, and then it slowly became something real to me when I was younger. And then as I understood it more throughout that 10 plus years when I actually started working in the industry, my perspective adapted to all of that. But then on the cultural side, it doesn't compute. It doesn't make sense in a lot of ways to me culturally, as a Blackfoot person. and how that affects me in my culture. So it's that's what I'm saying. There's two things I grapple with, and two things, and again, it might be specifically for Blackfoot people. I'm sure it's all the same for other Indigenous communities, but you're dealing with two things.
Very distinctly,
the urban setting, but then also the cultural side of how we live. And
so it's like a cultural acceptance of the technology is what you're referring to. Is that correct?
Yeah, in some ways, cultural acceptance and even being offered the opportunity to engage in outreach. Like that in itself is a struggle. For me, obviously, it's not, because I like, if I'm working with Blackfoot folks in my community, it's different. But, you know, even if I go to another community, like I can't just go to another community. I have to like do the work, to that outreach work. That, again, that's a whole monolith in itself too. Yeah. And it's a lot of work.
Yeah, well, that's an amazing perspective just about the complexities of, you know, technology itself, and then the acceptance of the technology within a given culture. So I really appreciate you sharing that. Mariya,
can I add to that real quick?
Yeah, keep going.
I do want to say this one last thing. The Indigenous musicians that are working in the music industry right now and are, like I said, they have a voice. They, like, people don't know this, but they know how to navigate technology. They know how to navigate, and like with the support of a team, know how to understand streaming platforms, TikTok, all of that stuff, whatever is going on in social media. Like those, there are still strategies built for artists that have gotten that opportunity to step off the reserve, or step into this new world of the music industry. So the other thing I want to acknowledge is that when and if it happens that technology like that is more introduced and more is more reoccurring in the community, we're really smart with it, and with what we understand in technology for Indigenous people. Once we get an understanding of like what's going on, the work ethic that comes with that is a lot of strong, powerful strategizing that can help an Indigenous artist get to the next level in their career.
Fantastic. Thanks for sharing. And obviously you're experiencing some of that right now with the work that you're doing in your current role. Mariya, I wanted to move over to you. I mean, you do so many different things as an artist in this community. And when we were chatting about the panel itself, we talked about technology a little bit. We talked about some of the other work that you do around mental health, specifically in healing, which I want to get into in a minute. And this is for those that are not professional songwriters that are in the audience. But why don't you, just related to technology, how you're co-writing and collaborating with artists that you don't even see, that are not sitting in the same room with you.
Yeah.
I mean, this is a normal thing for songwriters that are, you know, in this room right now. But if you're sort of new to this discussion, co-creation and co-collaboration, because the technology is ultimately universal now, through the sharing of files, WAV files and things. So talk about some of the work that you're doing as a writer now with some collaborators.
Yeah, absolutely. Pre-pandemic, a lot of the folks that I was writing with were often based here in Calgary, Monkenstis, and we were doing in-person writes. And then obviously we were all in our houses and shows stopped. And for me, I didn't realize until the pandemic how much playing live actually balanced my brain, because I had a major crash when I wasn't able to play live and connect with people in person. But luckily, folks started being willing to do Zoom co-writes, which was incredible, because instead of just writing within my local community, we were able to actually co-write with people all around the world. And it's led to some really interesting opportunities. I've been co-writing with a producer out of the UK and another artist based here in Calgary. And it was fun because we would turn on actually a software called Audio Movers. Has anybody heard of Audio Movers here? Okay, you've heard of Audio Movers for sure. It's really incredible. We were working on an EDM project because I write outside of country as well. And the producer from the UK, it'd be 7 p.m. where he was at, and we would be, it'd be like 10 a.m. in Calgary. And he would be actually sending beats like to our ears. He could live stream as he was producing a track, which was incredible and totally changed the writing process. And from collaborating with Lost You in the UK and meeting some other writers from around the world, I ended up ghost vocaling, like Milli Vanilli ghost vocaling a project called Hearts on the Run. It was wild. So it was to me, it's kind of the baseline of what technology has done in the last little bit. Together, we had 2 artists and like singers from Alberta, one from Pennsylvania, and then a person from Norway and a person from Sweden. And we basically, we produced 50 songs in about 2 months, written and recorded. And the project's called Hearts on the Run, and it was just licensed by Universal Music Norway, which is kind of wild. So my face is not on it and my name is not on it, but if you listen to the songs, you'll hear my voice and Madison Olds. And so as a country artist whose like main drive and also the thing that balanced my brain, live music, when that was gone, this project really was able to kind of pull me up from the depths a little bit and keep me connected to a community and a wider community than I had ever experienced before. And then on top of that, the other thing that I think is really interesting with songwriting and co-writing is, while it is what I do as a career, it's also a really huge outlet for me, and it's how I am able to process my feelings and emotions. I feel it. You guys feel that? I feel it. Okay, cool. And anyway, so in 2020, I was an artist in residence at the Women's Center of Calgary and ended up teaching a couple workshops to some of the teens there. And it was really incredible because music is a universal language that all of us can understand, and it's a language that we can all communicate in. And working with these teen gals was really incredible because there was a lot of heaviness in those sessions, but also a lot of self-empowerment and lightness. And I think that technology, yes, can help us advance our careers as well, but it can also be a really great connection tool in times of darkness when we're talking about using creativity as an outlet to feel some stuff and to know that we're not alone.
Right. Thanks, Mariya, for that perspective. Beni, I wanted to come back to you and just kind of building off some of the things Mariya and Curtis shared about the challenges of technology as well as the opportunities of technology, whether it's cultural acceptance or just usability. Some of your work, I know you've been involved with Advance, Canada's Black Music Business Collective, and I'm wondering if there has been any similar challenges to what Curtis shared with us for the Black community in this country as it relates to the work you're doing with Advance, and does technology play a role in there, or are there similar challenges around the community around just advancing Black music, Black voices within the Canadian music industry sector?
Super loaded question, man. That is.
Now's the time to share it.
There's
right?
layers on layers on layers without trying to call out too many things. So, I would say when you say Black music, I think automatically, just to generalize or make a general statement, that some people would just go to hip hop. It's hip hop. That's rap. But Black music is rock and roll. It's country. You know, it is jazz. Of course, it's hip hop. It's all of things. And the fact that we have to have these categories called urban music or contemporary R&B and traditional R&B, or don't know how to place an Afrobeats artist, so you place him in an R&B category because he had one song on a 20-song album. It's a very difficult space to be in right now because is that technology or is that politics? What is that? You're talking about limiting people's creation and an audience to these categories that don't match expression. So I think in the next, while hopefully it's about expanding what those genres are or how they're classified or allowing people to be multi-genre. When you're saying you're a Black artist, again, you kind of are shuffled into a couple categories. Someone like Ed Sheeran can do R&B and pop and whatever he wants to do and get those categories. But if you're Black, automatically you're just an R&B. You can't be pop. You can't be some of the other categories. It's a very interesting thing when you look at the categories. But again, I don't want to ruffle too many feathers up here.
Do it.
But when you do look at,
Go for it.
the people giving away awards, that's what I'll say. The people giving away awards, just look at the categories and look at where the Black artists are shuffled into versus not. And even just if it's just a visual thing versus having to go listen to everybody's music, it's been a very limiting thing. within the country. You've even had some of the top artists like Drake being recognized in the States before they were ever recognized here, because we didn't understand how to categorize that. And yeah, I mean, it's such a loaded question. There's so many other layers outside of awards and categories and genres. But just to even be a creator and be allowed to kind of be in different spaces as well. When you say country music, luckily there's a couple black artists. Shasha, I know I think she's from Alberta too, isn't she?
No, she's from out east.
Out east, okay. But I know she's been popping up here the past few months a lot and stuff like that. It's very cool to see black artists be recognized a little bit more in Canadian music. And I think as time passes, one of those things and the challenges that we do face is just to not be limited, I think, is the way that I'll kind of wrap it up. Limited by categories.
Yeah, no, but very well said. And I think bringing up loaded questions is part of how we're going
here
to deal.
I'm trying to have access to these places.
That's why you're on this panel. That's why this large question of what is the future of music? And what we talk so much about diversity, equity, and inclusion in our society today, and I think it's incumbent upon all of us to take action. Not just to talk about it. You got to take real action. And how do you take action? By having these conversations. So I think it's important to ask loaded questions and hear what you have to say about it, and share those views on this platform, which is right on this stage right now during the CCMAs. It's important to be able to do that. So thank you, for sharing. We've got a few minutes left. I want to try to wrap up something that I think I've heard from all of you, at least implied. And I've chatted with some of you sort of before. Actually, I chatted with all of you before this, but and it all of you are involved with this in one way or another. And it's this notion of healing, wellness, medicine. And we all have a different definition for it. But I think when we think about the future of music, how do we find a way to work together? When you hear some of the challenges that have been expressed by Curtis and Beni and Mariya and Evan, there's opportunities. Technology is an opportunity. How you harness and what you do with it is the work that's involved. But there's also a lot of challenges, before the technology actually becomes useful. And we're in a there's a great reckoning going on in our culture right now. And how do we all heal from the trauma that all of us have gone through, especially some of the stories that you've shared here with us today. And Mariya, I wanted to start with you because I know Evan's working in healthcare a little bit with technology, and I know, Mariya, you've done some work at the Drop-In Center, and I think that's very powerful. And I think for the Indigenous community and the Black music community, I think there's a growing acceptance and a desire to have more inclusivity and representation in the industry, but there's still work to do, as you both clearly identified. So Mariya, why don't we start with you around why, I'm curious, what inspired you to, as an artist, to reach out and offer music as a form of healing?
I think because music is what heals me, but I think even baseline, if we're talking about equity, inclusion, and accessibility and diversity, I think a big piece of it is before we even get to healing, there needs to be acknowledgement of hurt and of systemic injustices. And that's on, and again, I don't want to ruffle any feathers, but that's on us white people, because I know for me, it was a huge shock when I learned about my privilege, which is the baseline of privilege, and also the most damaging piece of it, because you're just so blissfully unaware of the system and how many things you have as a white person stacked for you. So I think when we talk about healing, the first thing for me is that I know that I have to acknowledge my privilege. I know that I have a lot more work to do, and I know when I'm in these spaces that I'm consistently going to make mistakes, but I'm going to try to do better every time. And so that's where I would start, is with music. There's always healing and there's always connection, but unless there's integrity and curiosity and kindness and a willingness to make space for voices that are not as privileged as me, then there's no healing. So anyway, that's what I would say about that.
Thanks for sharing that. Absolutely. Really great. Beni, anything you want to add to that? I mean, in terms of sort of the steps forward, in terms of getting to a place where we can all, work together and rectify some of the things that Mariya just shared.
I think in a big umbrella of it all is just education, right? Once you can get educated on what's happening, how it's been happening, you can start to evaluate what needs to be done and how it can be looked at, how it can be assessed, and how you can play a role in it and play a place in it. And I think even as like you're looking at just certain things in communities and people in general, some of us, actually we were all artists at one point. But there's more to being in the music industry than just being an artist, right? And just educating people on stage hands or artist management or booking talent, publishing, all that kind of stuff. Once all the different factions of the industry is also aware and educated on the different things, and they can look to the left and look to the right and realize that there's no black folks in there, there's no indigenous folks in there, there's no Asian folks in there. You can start to spread that understanding, and why, maybe because of a little bit of access as well. But sometimes you don't even know what you don't know. And a lot of times in the different spaces, you're not even aware that you can be an artist manager for your friend, or a book or talent booker, or in publishing, because you're unaware of what's in front of you. And it's like, I think the scope is kind of wide, but just to jump into another industry super quick, I know that there's a lot of like film stuff coming to Calgary right now. But one of the problems that they said that they have is that they can't continue production because there's not enough people here. Right now, there's a production I know of that wants to have just a regular crew, and they need a girl to hold the boom. And I'm like, well, why specifically a girl, and why specifically a boom? They're like, we're trying to create inclusivity and diversity on our sets, and literally she'd get $600 for the whole day just to hold the mic. And I'm like, do you think people even know what that name is, like a boom mic operator? Like, unless you were in the industry, you just don't know. So you refer that back to the music industry, and there's just like 70 or 80 jobs in the music industry that I think a lot of people would stop at about a dozen and be like, I don't know what else there is. So you're educating people on the roles that exist, the roles that they can play in those roles, and then you can look at the bigger socioeconomic, political, cultural, capitalist. It's deep. It's deep. We've only got 5 minutes left, man. Like,
That's all right.
we don't got time for all this.
Your point about there's jobs in front of a microphone, there's musically, figuratively speaking, there's a lot of jobs behind the microphone, right? And I think you've identified some really great examples. Curtis, anything you want to share? I mean, in this age around healing, obviously truth and reconciliation is a big part of what we're talking about here. Anything you'd like to share?
No, I don't have to touch on truth and reconciliation, because that's cool, but it's not something that always has to be discussed about at panels, because I'm already in the midst of healing. I'm already in the midst of living my day-to-day life as a Blackfoot person, and going through the process of understanding what I've gone through personally within these settings. I don't think and that's a challenge that I find a lot of times, is that when we talk about healing, people think like, okay, well, if it's collectively amongst a different amount of people, diverse people, like if it's in Canada, they talk about truth and reconciliation, they talk about all this stuff. And I'm like, that's not even for Blackfoot people. And again, I only say this for Blackfoot people because I come from that space. That's who I am. When I think about that, as a Blackfoot man, that those harms have been done. And again, this is for me personally. This is not for anyone to take home and to be like, oh yeah, I'm going to start thinking that way. But for me, when my grandma, when my mom talks about this experiences they've had with all of that stuff, we don't have to get into it, but IRS, everything, they talk about it as, okay, well, we have to continue moving forward, because if we dwell on that, it's just going to cause more harm. And that's a part of who I am. You know, I've experienced things. And the thing is, like, people thinks it's like IRS, just that. And like, no, there's like, I experienced things in elementary school, some really racist stuff in elementary school, physical harm done to me in elementary school, in Sunday church stuff that has happened. Like, I experienced those things. And when I think about that and think about healing, like for me, I'm on that journey. Me and my family are on that journey. And it's a long process. When it comes to the music industry, though, one of the things we're talking about as a collective, that's the other thing where I'm like sitting here and I'm like kind of knocking my head where I'm like, I don't know if that has to be like collective. I don't know if that has to be all of us together. I'm okay with going back, like, you know, for me, and I'll say this, being a music industry person, like, it's not easy on our families for like, you know, their support for us. For a Blackfoot person, if you have a partner and you have a wife, you're not whole if you go to something and you're without them. That's just how we are. That's how we interact as a people. But the healing process is after this. If I'm feeling something upset about something that is said here or something's in my mind, not saying that that's happening, we have our own healing structure in talking about things. The same thing goes for my community. If something happens, you know, we'll go back to like the people that we trust and elders that we, you know, that are part of our community. And that's a collective healing within us as Blackfoot people. But that doesn't have to be with other non-Blackfoot people. Like, I don't think that when we say like all of us collectively, like, I don't have to worry about anyone else's healing except for my own, my family's, and my communities. And that's important. And the same goes for other Indigenous communities too. When it comes to music, when it comes to being there. So like, you know, when it comes to like, yeah, because it is a loaded question. It's all these questions are really loaded, but they're really complicated when you get to folks, to BIPOC folks, to people who have those lived experiences around racism, mistreatment, and all of those things. Because, you know, for myself, I don't see, for within my community and then in my own perspective within the music industry, that I need anyone else to heal with or to talk about healing with me or anything like that outside of my family and the community that I come from. And when I talk about it with elders that are trusted, and family too, because that's what matters more to me.
Thank you for sharing that. That's a really very interesting. I learned a lot. Very interesting perspective.
Love that perspective too.
Yeah.
You can't pour from an empty cup.
Yeah.
And sometimes like it is about you just doing your own work. I know that you guys had to do your own work to understand your history, and same with us. And I think sometimes it's a little bit half-hearted to say, now you teach me. Now you tell me what to do. That's a little, you know.
Yeah, it's
Anyways,
not,
loaded question.
Yeah, we got to all do our own labor. That's how it goes.
Yes.
Evan, anything you want to share around this broad, you know, you're a tech entrepreneur. You've been at this a long time. You got involved in the music industry a long time ago, founding Maple Music. You moved into, you know, things like healthcare with technology. You've coached a lot of entrepreneurs. Anything you want to add?
This has been a really interesting opportunity, and yeah, I mean, only the good things come out of taking risk, right? So we're taking a lot of emotional risk by saying what we're saying out here, and I think though that sort of the sort of open hearts and clear minds is really important, which is lacking everywhere because of the dangerous nature of social media. Like what social media gives us, it takes, right? So I want to start there because, as we all know, there's an elephant in the room. There's a lot of polarization going on in this country. Though I still think, you know, having traveled the world and lived and worked with many people around the world, I think Canada has the greatest opportunity to be the best country in the world to live in for all the sins we've committed in the past and all the problems we've got. Because each one of us has a different story, which I find really interesting. That's the one thing that I find fascinating. I was part of a Chinese-Canadian panel. And the one thing we did realize is every one of us has a different story. I basically come from a political refugee family. And my father, more or less, when I was a young man, told us we burned the boats. He cannot go back to mainland China. He can't go back to Taiwan. He has alienated both political groups, which are at war with each other, and we're here forever, right? Back in the 1950s, he was also on some kind of American list that he couldn't go to university in the States. Right? He had a full ride scholarship to Yale from China, for example. So we all have these crazy, complicated stories. And I talked to other Chinese Canadians. We have our own divisions. right? So I'm Northern Chinese, Mandarin speaking, or Shanghainese speaking, and most Chinese Canadians are Cantonese, right? So we look the same to most people on the outside, but we're not, right? And our stories are different. So, but I'll talk about music because, to me, music is identity, right? And one thing that's universal, and I do executive coaching, and I work with a lot of mainly tech executives, and a lot of them are fairly senior. And one universal theme is the executive coaching is supposed to be about business, and it always devolves into personal shit, basically, because you can't separate the two. No. Their lives, their marriages, or their children, or their parental expectations, and you'd be really amazed how many senior executives have ghosts of their parents sitting on their shoulders, right? So the one thing I've seen that's common is a person's search for identity of whatever it is for them, and a search for meaning, right? And so music to me is important because it's self-expression at the end of the day, right? And I'm with you guys on this whole categorization. I struggle with it because music is business, right? Unfortunately, or fortunately, depending on how you look at it. And there are big forces out there. And business likes things that are well organized, and they like categorization. It makes it simple. It makes it simple to sell the music, market the artists, whatever it is. So they want to plop you in somewhere. It makes no sense. I feel the pain of you wrote music in this genre and you're not allowed to switch. Not just industry, your fans won't allow you to switch, for heaven's sake, right? So I struggle with that because I'm an omnivorous music consumer, and I love every genre out there. I just find it fascinating, and I come from a culture, at least my immigrant family, of cultural appropriation doesn't exist in our world. That might be a little controversial, but that doesn't even occur to them. They just pick up a beat, a song, a riff, whatever, an instrument, they start adding it in, right? And I struggle with that. I don't know what the right answer, by the way, at all is with this stuff, right? But I know it's like back to, good artists steal and great artists steal with both hands. The future allows us to do that even more and more, and it's going to get more complicated, I think, more and more complicated. So,
the future of music is complicated, which has been a little bit of what I've tried to do with this panel today. It is a loaded question, the future of music, because it's about identity and expression, and it's very individual, depending on, as you've heard today, where you come from and what your cultural background is. And so as part of Country Music Week, what knowledge can you take away from these learnings that you heard from these panelists, these amazing panelists here today, that help you in your journey as an artist? And it's applicable. These are truths that have many, many generations of history within them. So can you find inspiration and learnings in any of what you've heard today? I mean, we've talked about things like history, we've talked about tools, technology, of course, file sharing, sending vocals to other parts of the world, songwriting, community development, the challenges of community development, the perspectives of community development. Resiliency, we've talked a little bit about that. Adaptability, all the things that were part of this panel today, diversity, equity, and inclusion. We didn't dive into all of these in grave detail in the limited time that we had, but I felt it was really important to shine a light on these amazing leaders who are very thoughtful, who have done incredible things, in some cases, in a relatively short amount of time. If you just think about 2014, 2015 was not that long ago, but to take up that kind of leadership that you have, Curtis and Beni and Mariya and Evan, you've been at this a little bit longer, shows incredible, I think, leadership and inspiration for seeing something that needs to be changed or seeing something that needs to be given a voice. And I think identifying for us, in the case of something as we take for granted, that we all have internet access. I mean, a lot of people don't realize that, Indigenous communities don't have that to the degree that we do, as white people. So I think that's just an important lesson as well to share about how all of these things are tied to, in one way or another, to the future of music. And they have a very local story about them here in Mohkinstsis, Calgary. And with Canadian Music Week being here, I think it's been really inspirational to shine a light on these Calgary leaders and the work that they've done in music, whether it's been coaching tech entrepreneurs that may want to get into music. Evan, who knows if there's a few of those evolving around here in Calgary, and what advice you could give them through your work and experience, or helping artists, Mariya, be inspired by the work that you do in the country music community and others in the hip hop community. Beni, you do amazing things. I know you might be off to another music gathering in Toronto later this afternoon to do some more of your great work.
I just might.
Yeah, or Curtis, the work that you're doing now, full time, to help Indigenous artists and become successful in the music industry, whatever success means to all of you. So I just wanted to do a shout out to all of our panelists here who have all contributing to the future of music. Let's hear it for them. Happy birthday to you again, Curtis. I hope you have a wonderful birthday today. Top 40 under 40, top 40 under 40. You still got time, Mariya. Sorry, Evan. I think you're too late. Maybe there's another category for you. I'm Andrew. Thank you for letting me moderate today. Linda from CCMAs, thanks for inviting me to do this. It's been a great privilege. I love talking about music. I love learning. I've learned so much today. And I wish you a really wonderful rest of the CCMA weekend and Country Music Week here in Calgary. Thank you for coming. Once again, thank you to my guests on the panel, and thank you to the CCMAs for putting together the speaker series, and to all those involved in bringing this year's Canadian Country Music Awards back to Calgary for a record-breaking 10th year. Thank you to the CCMA Host Committee, Tourism Calgary, all levels of government, Factor, and everyone involved, from staff, volunteers, artists, sponsors, and fans for making Country Music Week such a success. Lastly, thanks again to West Anthem for co-presenting this panel with the National Music Centre. National Music Centre is a registered charity with a mission to amplify the love, sharing, and understanding of music, and we rely on donor support to achieve this mission. If you like the show, or anything else NMC is doing, please consider leaving us a donation. NMC Amplifier is recorded on Treaty 7 in Mohkinstsis, Calgary, Alberta, Canada, at Studio Bell, home of the National Music Centre, and hosted by me, Andrew Mosker. Our executive producer is Brandon Wallace. Technical producer, AV and post-production supervisor is Chad Schroeder-Gillespie. Video and audio production team include Raphael Salas, Phil Jukes, Caden Chenoweth, Matt Feature, David Kativu, and Jacob Barton. Marketing, design, and publishing by Brandon Wallace, Juliana Capone, Emily Holloway, and Brett Cassidy. And Ioana Busiak is our administrative coordinator. To learn more about National Music Centre, go to studiobell.ca. Thanks again for tuning in. Until next time, au revoir.